Welcome to the OptionsCity webinar, exploring the latest volatility advancements in Metro 5.2. We're excited to talk through some ideas and take your questions online. You can do that throughout the entire webinar, and we'll take those questions at the end of the call. My name is John Churchill. I'm the VP of Sales at OptionsCity. With me is Dave Hrencecin, our Director of Quantitative Analytics.
Hey there.
Dave, we've got a lot to talk about. 5.2 is kind of a nice milestone for us. Tell us what we're going to review.
Sure. Let's get started. So first off, just have a legal disclaimer. We'll put that up for you. Cover our backsides. And let's get started. All right. So what we're going to be talking about is volatility mostly, how that's going to tie in to future, and focusing on what we've actually got in version 5.2. And the main feature that we'll be discussing is the Parameterizing the Center. Basically, it's early steps in providing us with volatility surface functionality, and it will help traders who have issues with fitting volatility Smirks with like the two-sided model, for example. And it also helps for clients who might like to use cubic splines with delta for the strike points. And then, as I said, we'll talk about how this also impacts the volatility dynamic. We've added to 5.2 the implementation of a sticky strike dynamic. And you can get that when you use a strike point type for all the curve points.
So we're gonna cover three things. You're gonna go through the what 5.2 is now, and then how that blends into something down the road. Parameterizing the center, and then the impact of the vol curves.
Yes.
Three main ideas. Great.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so let's start with 5.2 right now and where that's bringing us. So what we've got is some improved market fitting volatility curve options. That's namely the ability to unlock the driver point of the curve. The center typically was modeled on the spot price, and now we're parameterizing that. In the long term, that's going to provide us with volatility surface support. And I mean, that's just generally a streamlined management of multiple contracts. So let's say you're trading in the energy space and you've got 5 years of quarterlies and monthly contracts, and you want to try and fit things in a more global sense. That helps with that, and that's what we're going to be moving towards in the long term. Okay. We're also adding flexibility with the volatility dynamic, and just as a general idea, all along the process of putting in new functionality and features into Metro, we're looking at established research. These papers are examples of that, because what we really are trying to do is support what clients want and what they need in order to be competitive in the markets. So to start, let's remind ourselves about the vol path. So we gave a webinar in the past on volatility dynamics and what the vol path is. So we will not cover a big deal on that right now. If you're interested in that, you can check out our website and look up that webinar. I highly recommend it if this is something that's not familiar with you. But basically what we've got is a curve in green on this picture that determines the volatility for different levels of the underlying. All right, so here we've got the spot price. Currently, this is an example of a vol slide in sort of a hypothetical E-minis market, and spot price in this case is around is around 1800. And as the underlying moves, let's go back, then the vol curve moves with it. And you'll note that center point that's in green is moving down that curving green vol path and further, and the curve moves along with. So basically the volatility path tells what level you want the volatility curve to be at a given point in the underlying price, and it also impacts pricing, and it impacts how the Greeks perform. So now let's talk about parameterizing the center. In order to understand what's meant by this, we need to start with some simple examples. So vol curve functions, basic vol curve function would be to take a simple quadratic polynomial like this. Basically, if we have a very simple function that has a single variable, x, and that variable could be the strike, it could also be a delta of the option, or it could be the difference between the strike and the underlying, and we'll use a vol curve for both the call skew and the put skew. And the reason that we might do this in a simple case is that generally the shape of volatility cross strikes is not going to be consistently one curve. It changes in a nonlinear fashion and a non-polynomial fashion. So we've got a simple model that tries to be flexible enough to just capture what's being priced in the market as best as possible. So here's an example. It's fake data, but let's just assume that we're looking at something like, for example, the E-minis. Now, this on the surface looks like it's a reasonably good fit. Okay, reasonably good fit in the markets. But if you take a closer look on the upside, for example, the general shape of those values are curving up faster at a more curved rate than the orange curve that we're trying to use to fit things. And then if you look over on the put side, on the left, we actually have a location where the curve is actually not doing a very good job. It's overestimating both the bid and the ask price. And it's one of those things where we kind of have a trade-off. In this region here, we're overestimating with our vol curve, and then still on the put side, we're actually underestimating. And that actually is indicative of a curvature in the market that's actually less than the curvature that we're using in our model to fit the markets. And that actually extends through the at the money and on beyond to the right side, or the upper strike values in the call skew. All right.
So we've done some things in 5.2 that are going to help our traders better analyze this, right?
Yes, absolutely. So here's a just close-up here of exactly what I said. The curvature is looking to be a bit more gradual, but in order to fit the markets with this simple model, it doesn't quite fit the bill. So now going a step further, in 5.2, we've actually opened up that assumption so that you now have the ability to join those two curves at any particular point that you like. It doesn't have to be the spot price anymore. This allows you more enhanced flexibility for fitting the market data. So let's take a look. Originally, this is what we looked at. We've got the curve. It fits reasonably well, but now let's take that center point and shift it up, let's say 1/8 standard deviation. Now we actually fit the market data a lot better, and we've freed up the requirement to have specifically a call side and a put side being defined to the left of spot and to the right of spot. Now, one other thing that you'll note is that we did not change the level of the at the money vol. That's where the green curve intersects. That stayed exactly level with before. It's the center of those two curves that's moved. And that's a new functionality in 5.2 that you can access as soon as you have that in front of you. All right. Now, another approach that's fairly common is to use a cubic spline. That is a bit more flexible than what we just talked about because you can have any number of points that you like. Commonly, you might use 3 or 4 points to the left of spot and 3 or 4 points to the right of spot, and then just glue together a curve for one segment, another curve for another segment, and they all are functions that have this general form, and they're defined in a way that at the glue points, those points that we're joining the curves at, we've got the same volatility, and for example, might match spot. So these points, these vol curves, they're glued together, the vols match, the slopes match, and that's a typical cubic spline approach. And as an example, we have prior to 5.2 the way this would look in the system. So a client might decide they want to parameterize 2 points to the left, 3 points to the left of the at the money, at the 5 delta point, the 20 delta put point, and the 40 delta put point. And then we've got spot at 130, and then to the right we've got another 40 call, 20 call, and 5 call point. And then the volatility levels are defined according to some comparative level of value relative to the at the money of 25 vol. And the problem that you might have in this setup is if you're using this model for longer dated contracts, let's say a 1-year contract, the delta changes relative to the underlying. At early points in time, short time to expiration, it might be reasonably far away from the underlying. But as we go further in time, longer dated expiration contracts, we can actually have problems, issues with the underlying getting too close to those points. And what that will lead you to is basically it forces you for longer dated contracts to use a lower delta, maybe a 30 delta instead of a 40 delta. And that makes for maybe a less uniform way of fitting the markets. You can do it, but it's not as convenient as need be. So with 5.2, as with the two-sided quadratic example that I mentioned, we no longer have to include the spot price as one of those points that defines where the center of the curve is.
So that's a pretty significant shift for us in 5.2.
It's a lot more flexible, yes. What this means is that if you want to, you can actually model your curve based off of, instead of spot and at the money, you can actually model that center with a 50 delta strike and a 50 delta vol. Now, that's a feature that we have seen clients ask us about. They do use them in some markets. And so we put that in part because we're trying to address the client demands, but also because it helps going forward for vol surfaces. And we'll see that in a moment. So here's the 50 delta center. And already you see a bit more symmetry going on here. But the best thing, the key point is that when the longer dated contracts are being priced and fitted to the markets, that 50 delta point stays relative to 40 delta, 20 delta, 5 delta. The shape is roughly the same. And we no longer have this issue of that center point kind of crimping up. So that definitely makes life easier, especially when you're looking at fitting further expiries. Although, I mean, you could think of it more in terms of we can fit the markets any way we like, and we can move those points for longer dated contracts and for nearer dated contracts anywhere we'd like to do. That's the way you've been able to configure things since the beginning. The difference is that if you want to, you can use the same strike definition points across all of the contracts. And if you view that as in the back of this diagram here, we've got strikes and vols for the 3-year contract. We also have the one in the middle is the 1-year contract, the strikes going across the bottom, the vols going up, and the very short dated contract in the front, which is only the front quarterly. The thing that you'll note here is that in terms of strike, when you're thinking of things in terms of what's the vol at the 200 strike, these curves change shape over time. And that's not necessarily something that's useful if you're trying to, it's not necessarily something that's useful if you're trying to compare, for example, a 2-year volatility to the 1 and 3-year vol. So let's take a look at what happens if we change the perspective and put things in terms of delta.
Yeah, so why would showing vol surface by delta be more useful than by the strike?
Well, it goes back to what I was kind of saying before, is if, let's say, for example, we've only got market data for these 3 contracts, and some broker comes in and says, well, I want to trade a 2-year vol, and I want the 200 strike. And what's the contract going to price at that level? If we have things in the previous case where everything's in terms of strike, if you look at the front contract, the 200 strike wasn't even quoted in the market. And then we go back to the 1 year, it's in there, but it's quite off to the edge. Then we look at the 3-year contract, and it's actually much closer to the center of the market. The key point here is that when we're trying to compare volatility from one time to volatility at another time, what we want to be thinking about is an apples-to-apples comparison. We want to be looking at price movement in terms of how much noise we expect in 3 years' time versus how much noise we expect in 1 year time. And you can't think of that in terms of one strike. You want to try and normalize that into what's a 1 standard deviation move at 3 years, and what's a 1 standard deviation move in 1 year. And then if you know what that is, then you can kind of gauge what a 1 standard deviation move is in the 2-year period. And delta is very similar to that in terms of giving you similar information as to what's your chance, what's your sort of magnitude of price movement, what's your chance of ending up on that strike. There are different ways to think about it. And with delta, we have a curve shape that's much more consistent, specifically because it's more of an apples-to-apples comparison.
Okay.
And this is where we're basically heading. All right. So one more thing that this reparameterizing of the center gives us is an impact on the volatility dynamic. So let's refresh briefly what we already have and what you're probably familiar with, and that is the concept of a sticky delta. That first curve that you may recall from the beginning when I described what a vol path was an example of sticky delta. And prior to 5.2, if you wanted to have a vol path, you would be running on what we call a sticky delta framework. Now what that does is that determines where the at-the-money vol is, and then those points that define the curve all move in tandem with sort of equal distance from the center to the left and to the right and up and down the curve. Basically, one strike is represented in terms of delta, and then when you change where your spot price is, your 40 delta strike moves, and your vol is generally going to be determined by what the 40 delta strike was before and then what it is now. So here's an example of 3 curves. In this case, it's a hypothetical Eurodollar market. We've got vols, normal vols on the left side of the screen, 50 basis points up to 85 basis points. And at the 98.6 mark, we're running a 75 basis point vol. At 98.90 in the spot, we've got a 74 vol. And at 99.20 in the futures in the underlying, we've got a 70 vol. And what you'll note here is, and this may or may not be the kind of behavior that you want, but with the sticky delta framework, with that dynamic, the spread between, say, the 98.90 vol and the 98.60 vol is larger, and then as we move up in the underlying, because of the interaction of the shape of the vol path and the shape of the skew, it changes. So it was larger and it shrinks. Now that may be the case, but you might find in the markets that volatility levels from one rate level to another end up being roughly the same regardless of where your underlying is. And if that's the case, then you might be interested in a sticky strike volatility, which we now have in 5.2. And what that does is you'll note that the curve is no longer moving to the left and right. It's just moving up and down. Our defined points are now at the 98 strike, and it's fixed there. We've got a 99.75 strike as well, also fixed. And let's just highlight those. So we've got the 98, the 99.75 strike, and the center is fixed at, I think it's 98.90 in this case, or it might be in that realm. And the point is that as the vol path is determined by an underlying at 98.6, the curve level is set to intersect that at that price. But the actual curve shape is not moving left and right. It's simply sliding up and down to match the vol at the different levels. That changes your Greeks, that changes the pricing across how one contract is compared to another. And that's something that it all depends on your analysis of the market data, but that's something that you might be interested in.
So much better functionality that a trader can act on.
A lot more flexibility, yes. So you have a choice now on your vol dynamic. You can choose to use either a sticky strike or a sticky delta. Okay. Now, along with these enhancements that we've talked about, we've also had to take into consideration what we're going to be doing outside of those points. So we might have a point defined at 98 and a point defined at 99.75, and we're going to perhaps in the future interpolate between different times to expiration. But we also have to consider things like how things occur beyond the wings. And so we've put some thought in our wing behavior as well, and we've added two functionality for 5.2, a new wing type, so you can now choose amongst two different types, and we may add more in the future, that we're calling an exponentially decaying wing. And it depends on the market whether you'll find that to be of use, but I recommend when you get your hands on 5.2 to take a look at that. Another feature that we're capable of turning on if it's desired at some point is the ability to adjust the widths of the wing, and that will play into also the how we're going to build the curves across in between different contract expirations for pricing flex options, for example. So in summary, what we've got in 5.2 are some new abilities to define how the curve is represented, and we've replaced the assumption of the center always being spot with what we now have as a user-defined center. That could be defined in standard deviation, as a fixed strike to give you a vol dynamic that changes in character, or for example by delta or some fixed offset. Lots of different choices, and now the center is also controlled. So every single point that you define on the curve, you can now define instead of having a locked down spot that's going to follow the vol path. And that's much, much easier, much more flexible. And you can also use the old functionality if you like. It's basically old and new. Yeah.
So a good step forward, some nice changes, some good enhancements. And you talked about some future things too that are going to be coming up and just positioning us for a pretty big release coming up in end of the year with 6.0.
6.0 is coming up as well. I would say the vol surface functionality is going to be ongoing, and as we're able to put these features in, we'll be adding them as well.
Dave the Quant, as you're affectionately known at OptionsCity, thanks for going through all this. I think we may have some questions we can run through. If the audience has some additional questions they want to add, we'll take a moment to sift through some of those, but Wonderful. Thanks so much
Very
for
good.
going through this with us.
Very cool. So I just put up some references. I mentioned them. If you're interested in vol surfaces, these are 2 example papers that I've been looking at, and let's open up for questions.
Does this make it easier to fit further expiration dates?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, well, like for example, if you're trading in the energy space and you really want to think in terms of unit, oh yeah, I'll go back to the papers, somebody wants that. So in terms of the apples to apples comparison that I was talking about before, if you're looking at a 2-year contract and a 1-year contract, then it really is more consistent to think about things in terms of where's the 30 delta strike between those contracts. And so this makes it easier if you're already in the practice of modeling things with vol surfaces on your end and you're just simply using the models that we've got, then you can actually input everything in a apples to apples sense in that vol surface setup, that framework.
All right, good. So let's see. So the question is, the glue point for the curve, if it's moved off the center, for a, Dave, you want to run through that?
Yeah, sure. So if you move the point off of the center, what that can do for you is, like in the case of the S&P markets, for example, if you're setting things with that forced center being at a point in which the curvature isn't necessarily changing, and then we go down that Smirk, and the curvature is much higher on the high end of those strikes and not so much on the left, then what you can find is that the changes that occur in the shape of the curve and any kinds of transitions from one side to the other can be smoothed a bit. And obviously, if you're interested in talking about how to kind of use this new functionality, then we can certainly talk further about improving and how this will improve. And I'm happy to discuss offline on fitting techniques.
Yeah, I'd encourage anybody on the line, if you have a business development manager working with now, reach out to that person. If not, call me directly. My information is on one of the slides popping up next.
Very good. Thanks.
And I want to also encourage everybody to stop by our booth at FIA Chicago. That begins, I think, the evening of November 4th, and we'll have some exciting things to run through there. We'll be talking about some great new enhancements, future direction of the company as it relates to the product, and doing some cool things with Legos, I think. But we'll save that for later.
Okay, I think we got one more question, and then we'll wrap things up.
Do you have a specific software for Greeks management?
Right. That's something, I think if you're talking about do we have some framework in place for managing risk, then Metro actually certainly has the capabilities for doing that. We also have the ability to look across different spans of underlying, and by all means, if you haven't seen our software, then you can contact our sales force, contact John, and he'll get you in touch with someone who can give you a demo of all of our functionality.
If it's about risk, and we can tell them more about our Risk Command Center and how that might be able to help. David, thank you so much. We appreciate your time, and thanks everyone for joining. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you.